All right, so John Mackey, the CEO of Whole Foods, who is currently on his way to retirement as the company has been bought by Amazon, recently came out and gave his perspective on how apparently socialists have been taking over the country, and he laments the fact that just young people and workers in general just don't want to work. We're all just lazy pieces of shit. So I wanted to get into this article because I think it's absolutely amazing to be able to get into the mind of some of the most deranged capitalists on the planet. But here from The Guardian, they say the socialists are taking over. Whole Foods CEO John Mackey laments. So what are they talking about here? He said the socialists are taking over in a recent interview that he did with Reason magazine, which is apparently a libertarian outlet. But he said, quote, "They're marching through the institutions. They're taking everything over. They're taking over education." Okay, socialists have been taking over education. Trying to just piece together a little bit of what he could potentially mean by that. I mean, I could point to multiple different examples of fascists, like the governor of Florida, Ron DeSantis, aggressively banning books. He was banning like dozens of different math textbooks because he said they somehow had a woke Marxist ideology within them. The same exact governor in Florida, but this applies to many conservative states across the country, aggressively pushing to restrict what can be said in classrooms, especially when it comes to LGBTQ teachers just exercising their right to be who they are in the classroom. So, I mean, so many different examples that I could point to, both in the current sense and historically, of fascists and right-wing reactionaries trying to hijack and undercut our public education, but haven't really seen much in terms of socialists, let alone like nominally leftist people taking over the education sphere. But he continues saying it looks like they've taken over a lot of corporations. We've taken over a lot of corporations. Okay, so again, not exactly sure what he means by that. I mean, he could be indicating, how Starbucks and Amazon and a couple of different corporations have seen an increase in unionization rates over the last couple of months and years, which has been absolutely fantastic, and you love to see it. Obviously, a CEO of a corporation like Whole Foods, or any CEO for that matter, under a capitalist organization of our economy, is going to be inherently, vehemently anti-union because unions have that collective ability to protect workers instead of having the individual relationship with an authoritarian structure of a corporation. You have that ability to engage in collective bargaining to demand higher wages, better benefits, better working conditions, etc. So not surprised that he would be against unionization, and they're going to get to a little bit more details on the history of Whole Foods and unionization here in a second. But socialists taking over corporations, exactly, not really sure what he's talking about there. Apparently we had some sort of a vanguard revolution where we hijacked the means of production. I must have missed that, but he continues saying it looks like they've also apparently taken over the military, and it's just continuing. He again told the libertarian magazine Reason in a podcast that was released on Wednesday. So not only have we taken over corporations and education, but apparently we've also taken over the military. So I mean, congrats everybody. I must have missed that when I was on vacation this last weekend or something, but apparently we successfully took over the largest and most powerful imperialist capitalist force in the history of the planet. So good job on that one, guys. But he continues saying, I feel like with the way that freedom of speech is today, the movement on gun control, a lot of liberties that I've taken for granted most of my life, I think are under threat. So again, would love some clarification on exactly what he means by free speech is under threat today. I mean, I could point to, various problems that I have with capitalist companies like Facebook and Twitter having a monopoly on free speech in what I would consider to be the modern day public town square. But again, that would be a problem with capitalism and private corporations having a dominance over that, having a near monopoly over that, would have basically nothing whatsoever to do with socialists or something like that. But that's apparently his take. And also on the gun control debate, I mean, again, we've seen that tiny bipartisan pathetic gun control piece of legislation that was passed through the House and the Senate didn't even have some of the most popular common sense gun reform pieces within that piece of legislation. So again, not exactly sure what he's talking about here, as if the government is coming to take everybody's guns or something like that. We can't even get universal fucking background checks in this country. So again, he's kind of just in his head here. Seems like he's, throwing shit at the wall and just seeing what sticks. But they continue saying that Mackey pegged the candid sharing of his political opinions to his upcoming retirement as the Whole Foods chief executive in September. And he said, in 6 weeks, I will retire from Whole Foods, and I've muzzled myself since 2009, he said, referring to the op-ed he penned in the Wall Street Journal that year, where he compared Obamacare to fascism. he compared Obamacare to fascism. He's saying that he's muzzled himself since then, and now that he's retiring, he's going to be able to come out and give us many, many more of these absolutely amazing takes here. But again, seems like he's kind of like lost on what the definitions of these words mean. I mean, you could come up with plenty of different definitions and nuanced disagreements about what fascism and socialism and communism mean and how they've been implemented historically. But fascism, in my opinion at least, in a very rudimentary and basic way, is just the merger of corporations and the state and the military apparatus. So not exactly sure how Obamacare fits into that definition, but I mean, even Obamacare was a right-wing piece of healthcare legislation that was basically written by right-wing think tanks, and it was like a Mitt Romney-backed type of bill that at the end of the day really just gave gigantic handouts to private for-profit health insurance companies. So again, not exactly sure how that fits into the definition of fascism, but you know, that's his take on this. And they continue saying that Mackey co-founded a natural foods grocery store in 1978 that later merged with other stores to make Whole Foods, and the brand expanded, buying out smaller stores and competitors until it was bought by Amazon in 2017 for $13.7 billion. Okay, this libertarian here, absolutely, pushing forward with the idea that this is like a free market that we actually have here. Meanwhile, he's going behind the scenes and selling his company for $14 billion to a gigantic monopoly like Amazon that is already trying to get their filthy little tendrils in so many different industries across the United States. I covered on my channel just a couple weeks ago them trying to buy up that healthcare company One Medical so that they can further try to privatize some of our public systems that we have, the very limited ones that we have like Medicare and Medicaid and etc. But the idea that like you're some sort of a libertarian who believes in like true free market economics and then you're turning around and selling your company for $14 billion to one of the largest monopolies on the planet seems a little bit contradictory there. But they say that Mackey and the Whole Foods brand are credited with helping to popularize organic food in the United States, and the chain has about 500 stores across the US, Canada, and the UK. And he says in his interview with Reason, Mackey criticized the younger generations, saying they don't seem like they want to work. And he said younger people aren't quick to work because they want meaningful work, he said. You can't expect to start with meaningful work. You're going to have to earn it over time. So again, I mean, giving a very charitable interpretation of what he's saying here, it's just another bullshit capitalist propaganda piece that we've been hearing, especially over the course of the pandemic. This idea that like, oh, nobody just wants to work, right? I mean, it's completely ridiculous. If you had a company, especially one that's apparently worth $14 billion, that's now owned by the single largest corporation in the planet or one of the largest corporations in the planet like Amazon, you would think that if you wanted people to be willing to sign up for jobs at your company, that you could simply offer them better working conditions, better benefits, better wages, etc. But no, it just must be the case that all of these young people are just lazy pieces of shit, instead of it being the case that we've had like stagnant wages for decades in this country. Wages are not keeping pace with productivity. We have massive levels of inequality. We have CEOs like this motherfucker making millions and millions of dollars on an annual basis. I'm sure he's getting an absolutely gigantic payout on his way out of this company. So I mean, just completely ridiculous, this idea that like working class people deserve any of the blame for the current situation in the American economy. I mean, these are the dictators that control our economic system. These are the people who have basically unchecked unilateral control over actual working people's lives, and they're turning around and blaming those working people for just being lazy or not being willing to be complete cogs in the machine to serve the interests of the shareholders of these companies. But that's of course the narrative that he is going to run with as an absolute capitalist ghoul. But they continue with a little bit more perspective in terms of why people may be a little bit hesitant to work for companies like Amazon or Whole Foods, saying that over the last few years, Amazon has been staunchly resisting unionization efforts, particularly in its warehouses, and Whole Foods has been no exception. They say in 2020, it was revealed that the company created a heat map to track stores that were at risk of unionization. Again, this idea that like there's a risk inherent to workers engaging in collective organization to simply demand better wages, better benefits, better working conditions, etc. I mean, obviously this gets to a fundamental class antagonism under a capitalist system between workers and capitalists. I mean, they want you to be basically, again, a cog in the machine. They want you to work for as little wage as possible. They want to spend as less as possible as they physically can on, making sure that there's adequate working conditions, especially at a corporation like Amazon. We saw this with Chris Smalls and his thankfully successful unionization attempt at the JFK 8 facility. But how did that all start? I mean, he did a walkout basically because Amazon was not giving them adequate COVID protections. So, I mean, the idea that like these corporations or that capitalism in general is ever going to look out for the best interests of the workers, and that workers just need to sit down and put their heads down and just work harder in order to get by in life, it's just completely fucking ridiculous. Obviously, workers would be much better suited to form some sort of a collective organization, whether that's in, a union under a capitalist mode of production, or whether it's going beyond that with revolutionary ambitions or whatever it may be. The fundamental reality of this is that workers are never going to get anything handed to them by capitalists or by the capitalist system. You have to engage in solidarity. You have to engage in that collective organization and even militant action in some circumstances in order to get even just crumbs from a lot of these ghouls. But they continue saying that even before Amazon's acquisition of the grocery chain, the company had a history of working against unions, including hiring an anti-union consulting firm and amending the employee handbook to ban recording of all work-related activities without management approval. So yeah, I mean, when I have nothing to hide, I always go and I ban my workers from being able to record anything on the premises unless a manager says that it's okay. I mean, just completely fucking ridiculous. But they say when Amazon enacted a $15 minimum wage for workers, including Whole Foods employees in 2019, workers at the chain said that they saw their hours cut. So even in a circumstance where, Amazon raises their minimum wage to $15 an hour, which, oh, by the way, they literally only did because I think it was Ro Khanna and Bernie Sanders were putting forward the Stop Bezos Act in order to try to crack down on a lot of these corporations paying starvation wages. So Amazon absolutely backed up to the wall, finally decided to raise their minimum wage to $15 an hour. But even if you want to talk about, average warehouse pay, this $15 an hour is significantly less than what most unionized warehouse workers make, which is usually more around like $25 to $30 an hour. So even on this front, they're still underpaying their employees and still extracting as much surplus value off of their backs as they physically can. And again, even when they raise their wages, they say that workers still see their hours cut. So getting dicked one way or another, whether it's in tamping down your wages or tamping down your hours, again, a fundamental class antagonism that exists under a capitalist mode of production. But now I want to get into this clip here from I think a couple years ago when this guy John Mackey was sitting down and doing a debate with the socialist professor and YouTuber. I mean, he has his own channel. If you guys want to go check that out, it's a pretty good channel. But Richard Wolff. And so I wanted to watch this clip because he basically just completely obliterates him and the idea that he is like a true libertarian in any sense of the word. So let's go ahead and jump into this clip here.
John decided to take the millions or billions, I'm not sure, that he could have taken, like most CEOs do. He decided not to, and he decided to do something else with it. His personal decision. His alternative, if he didn't want to get paid all that money, would have been to lower the prices at Whole Foods, and everybody else would have saved the money that he is not taking anyway, and that would have distributed much more democratically what it is he chose not to take. When you distribute income and wealth in a highly unequal manner, so that some people get the vast bulk and the rest of us don't, you're leaving the power of the purchasing overwhelmingly in the hands of a minority that shapes what gets produced. That's the question of whether you are free or not, to use their language, or you live in a society that skews who gets produced, what gets produced, because you're giving a disproportionate amount of the income to a tiny portion of your population.
That would be true if we had a monopoly, but we don't. People can shop wherever they want to. That's capitalism. There's competition.
You sold your company to a monopoly. You know that.
Question here, in front of the...
Yeah, I mean, again, he just absolutely nailed it there. I mean, he's coming out here and preaching the, the merits of the so-called free market economy here, or the capitalist free market. Meanwhile, he literally just went and sold his company to one of the largest corporations on the planet, a monopoly like Amazon, and he has absolutely no justifiable response to that. And I think that Richard Wolff, as usual, did a great job at just cutting through to the fundamentals of what this conversation needs to really be about. We're talking about a system in which a tiny, tiny minority of people who sit at the top top who control vast disproportionate amounts of wealth in this country, the top 1%, the top 0.1%, whatever you want to call them, the capitalists, the people who own these companies. And basically at the end of the day, I mean, they serve the interests of their shareholders, whether that's selling your company to a monopoly like Amazon, whether that's gutting wages and benefits for average workers, whether that's, deploying union busting activities. All of that is in service of the profit motive. All of that is in service of the shareholders, the executives, the CEOs like John Mackey himself, and their personal bottom line. And so again, the lesson here at the end of the day is that if you actually want to have some sort of a pushback, if you want to have some sort of a check on that authoritarian system, you have to install some semblance of democracy in the workplace. In the immediate term, that obviously is going to come in the form of unionization drives, which is obviously very difficult, especially given the ownership of Whole Foods by a company like Amazon, which regularly violates labor law and prevents unionization attempts at their corporations, at their warehouses, or any of their various subsidiaries that they have purchased recently, including Whole Foods. So, I mean, it's a really uphill battle here, but in terms of just clawing back some of that power and instilling it into the hands of average workers who are actually producing the value for these corporations, that's where it's going to have to start. And so, at the end of the day, these motherfuckers are going to keep coming out here and complaining about radical socialists taking over, corporations and taking over the military and taking over our education system. It's all a distraction because I think at some level they are in panic mode right now. I think that a lot of these CEOs around the country and around the world right now are feeling a little bit of pressure because we have seen somewhat of a small revitalization of the American labor movement. And the last thing that these companies want to see, especially one like Amazon, is workers starting to recognize their power that they have in collective organization and collective militant action in order to make demands instead of asking for crumbs from these absolute demons.